G'day guys, back with the Outer Circle, and a few days ago they released an update on Warhammer the Old World, and I thought, hey, I haven't spoken a lot about Warhammer the Old World, I think it's time that I do so. And so today we're going to have a quick look at it, because I have some big red flags that I want to talk about. And I also want to point out something about the quality of the miniatures, but we'll get there. So, first things first, our update shows us some Bretonnian Knights, and it shows us some Tomb King parts. Now, it doesn't show us full knights, it doesn't show us full parts of these miniatures, but there's one thing you can immediately infer from looking at these Bretonnian helmets. They are chonky. And I don't mean that necessarily as a negative thing. Chonky is there for a reason. And when I say that term, what I'm referring to is the detail is very thick. Okay, it's not miniature necessarily, it's a very stylized version of a miniature helmet. So for example, look at the visor around the knight's eyes on the central helmet here. That visor sticks out a fair distance from the surface. The reason why that's done, well, one, it's easier to cast that detail first and foremost. And that's the thing that matters most to a company like Forge World. They don't want to be producing a lot of reject models, so they're going to make the details thicker. That way it's a lot easier to get the resin into there and make sure they get the air bubbles out in order to cast detail. If you make something very fine, one, it's harder to cast in the first place. Two, the mold will wear out faster because there's so many fine details in it, and a minimal amount of wear to the mold will mean that that detail is lost. So these are things to consider, and ever since they've gone to digital sculpting, I've actually found the detail has gotten a lot thicker than previously. I think one of the biggest examples of this is go look at the Emperor's Children Praetor in Terminator armor versus the Emperor's Children Phoenix Terminators, which were a 10-year-older kit and hand sculpted. And compare and contrast the quality of the two, and the Phoenix Terminators are absolutely gorgeous, possibly some of the best power armored miniatures ever produced by Games Workshop. And then you compare them to the Phoenix Terminator, which the sculptor did an okay job. Okay, he did not do a bad job on, but the detail is so different to those other Terminators that you just sort of go, really? Like, that's what you're going with? You know, and it kind of is like that here, because these are about as detailed as the metal miniatures produced in the late 90s and early 2000s for Bretonnian range. This doesn't look like it would be a miss on any third-party retailer's store, or it wouldn't be a miss on, a 3D printing page. There are so many people who do thickly detailed, almost Warcraft proportions of 3D printing, as opposed to fully realistic proportioned humans. And that is fine. Everyone will have their stylistic choice. But in this instance, it's very interesting because the line you will always get sold is Games Workshop produces the best miniatures, the finest crafted miniatures in the world. But if I jump over to something like Lost Kingdoms, okay? Lost Kingdoms has a Bretonnian and a Khemri themed range, okay? Copyright reasons, they're well within their bounds to do what they do. But have a look at the detail on these knights here, for example. Now, this is not cherry-picked, this is just a unit of Calyx knights, so one of the many different types of knights available to this faction. There are far more detailed characters than these. This is just a command unit. And have a look at the detail on their weapons, on the helmets. Okay, the little swan on the bucket helmet of this knight, for instance. And compare and contrast that with the detail over here. I think you would be very hard-pressed to say that Forge World / Games Workshop's miniatures here, and I dare say these are Forge World. I don't necessarily know if they're going to do a plastic starting set, but who knows. You'd be hard-pressed to say that this is finer detailed than these. I think Lost Kingdoms is definitely the winner, and when we scroll down and look at just some of this Khemri war gear here, which doesn't really look like Khemri to me, just going to put that out there. The weapons don't look Egyptian anymore. They look very much more like Dark Elves, just with the recurving on the blades and such. It looks more stylized. I guess it's to move it away from generic Egyptian, but it really looks like an Age of Sigmar reimagining of what the Tomb Kings would look like for copyright purposes as opposed to the original Tomb Kings. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'd be very interested to hear. And of course, in here is sort of a Cetera Pharaoh analog. And have a look at the detail you can see in here on this guy. So his arms, his weapon, all that kind of thing. His weapon has all hieroglyphics and such inscribed into it. He himself, the little unks and gems and cartouches hanging off his armor and body look fantastic. So when I compare them to these very, very chunky, again, I'm going to use that word, the scarab icons here, they're all very thickly proportioned. If this is the size they are actually manufactured at, they look almost like green stuff blobs that you would sort of sculpt and shape when you're first learning how to green stuff. They're very, simplistic, we'll say. And of course, the reason I note this is you can't go around calling yourself the premier miniatures company in the world and using that as a justification for skyrocketing prices when clearly the competition is as good, if not finer in detail. So I think that needs to strongly be considered when making those sort of claims. And, looking at the price of something like the Kingdom of Mercia, I think there is like an army bundle you can buy for them. And I think it's about £300. And I'm just scrolling through the page to see if I can find it. So there you go, £300. 300 euros. I believe that is. So in this 300 euros, you get what you would call a pretty decent Warhammer Fantasy Battles army. Here we have a picture. I think I have this somewhere, but this is an old sort of 4th, 5th edition, I'm going to say 5th edition, Chaos versus High Elves, okay? And these are moderate-sized, smaller-end armies for that era, okay? Lots of cavalry in here, nothing too special to look at. And then when you compare that to what you would get in a bundle like this, you're getting a lot of miniatures in here. 300 euros, okay? That's not cheap. That's $600 Australian. But $600 Australian, I've got a Chaos Dwarf army, and it's got less models than this does, and it cost an awful lot more than 600 Australian dollars when I bought it. So, therefore, what point I'm getting at here is, whatever happens with Warhammer the Old World, the miniatures are only going to be as nice as the competition. What is the price point going to be for the amount of miniatures you get? And knowing that Games Workshop has so many problems right now with production, okay, it's different from country to country, but they've got problems with keeping things in stock. They're taking a very long time to get things out for the other game systems that are not Warhammer 40,000, which just has an endless supply of crap being produced. And it is crap, make no mistakes about it. Because it's just endless miniatures and rules, and it's just creating bloat, not a better system. That's why it's crap. If you like the individual releases, that's fine. That is a completely different way of measuring things. But when you look at this situation, okay, I think back now to Forge World and how they've run the Horus Heresy for the last few years, and pre-COVID even. What happened with Horus Heresy? Well, it started out very strong. Okay, they started out, the release as an Imperial armor. It was super popular, way more popular than they imagined it would be. Could not keep up with the demand. So they brought in more staff. They legitimately went out of their way to hire more staff to work at Forge World back in 2012, after the huge release of the game system had happened in 2012. They brought in more staff over 12 and 13. And then it was rapid release of books from the end of 2013. It was every 6 months we got the next 4 books or so. And that was great. And then things started to really slacken off come 7th edition 40k ending, 8th edition 40k, and that new style and format taking off. And we ended up in this funny situation where Forge World just basically stopped caring, and they stopped doing real releases. Instead of 10 new models being revealed an open day, they went to 1 or 2 new models, and they didn't even do the open day anymore. Forge World used to have these awesome open day events, and they're long gone. Now it's just Warhammer World events, essentially, which is a real shame. What is going to happen with this game system? Well, if you go off historical precedent, that's what's going to happen with Warhammer, the Old World. Nobody wants that. What is the size of Warhammer the Old World going to be? Well, if it's the size of the old Warhammer Fantasy Battles game system, then that could be an issue as well, because part of what killed Warhammer the Old World originally, or Warhammer Forces of Battle, was it was such an expensive one to get into. Well, if Games Workshop brings out a game system now, which is the same scale, uses many of the same miniatures, or at least modern reincarnations of them, it can't be that much cheaper than Age of Sigmar, okay? Because otherwise people are just going to gravitate towards it and Age of Sigmar will die. That's shooting yourself in the foot, cutting your nose off to spite your face, all that. So that's no good as a concept. So what the hell happens with price and size here? Well, Warhammer the Old World has to have a price point that's basically on par model for model with Age of Sigmar, or at least unit effectiveness for Age of Sigmar. Now, they might not go for the giant monstrous creatures, but you know they're going to have to work a bit of that into there because, well, they're doing new Bretonnian and Tomb King sculpts. They're probably going to come up with new sculpts for other factions because it's set in the time of the Three Emperors, I believe, so it's set a few hundred years before Warhammer Fantasy Battles. That means things like the Empire aren't going to have all their gunpowder equipment. So it's not just a case as well of bring your old armies that you used to play fantasy with across, because your old armies that you used to play fantasy with don't exist in this time frame, because it's several hundred years earlier. High Elves, Dark Elves, Wood Elves, they'll probably all get away with the miniatures they had at the end of 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, but I don't see the rest of the factions also getting away with it. So quite an interesting spot we now find ourselves in this game system. And so I bring all of these concerns up because what then is going to be the realistic outcome for the game system? Well, I'm going to make a prediction. I did a prediction video back in, I think, December about what would be coming this year, and I think I've got everything right in that prediction video so far. So go back and check that out if you feel like it. And with that in mind, my prediction for Warhammer Fantasy is going to be something like this. The new and rejuvenated versions of the Old World will include a lot of familiar or similar units to the previous edition. Something like Bretonnia will still have things like questing knights. They will still have Knights of the Realm. They might even still have Grail Knights, Grail Guardians, that sort of thing. But with the success of Warhammer Total War, they will bring across some of those units from Warhammer Total War and give them physical miniatures on the tabletop in order to tie the two systems together. This will also include bringing out new sculpts for new units that simply didn't exist in previous Warhammer Fantasy. This is so you can't pick up and just play your old Warhammer army. That's why they have set it back in the past. Not because it necessarily gives them an open book for writing fluff and writing lore, although that is a small part of it, a very small part I want to add. So expect to see something like Tomb Kings having the Hyro Titan in there. No reason why they wouldn't. Okay? Expect to have Bretonnians have things like Grail Guardians, which is not a unit they physically had on the tabletop if I remember my 8th edition Bretonnia pretty well, and it was really their 6/7th edition book that they used. I also would expect something like the Empire to lose all of their black powder weapons and instead to gain some additional units, probably more around the cavalry sort of thing, because they do love using cavalry in these games. Potentially even a new version of the Demigryph Knights wouldn't be surprising, but I imagine something like Knights Panther or something like that, Knights of More, those more specialist types of knights would be something I think they would gravitate towards. I also think that with the Orcs and Goblins, because they're not going to be bringing back pretty much any of those Orcs and Goblin characters you know, because of the time period, they'll probably bring in new orcs and goblin characters, or ones that are mentioned in the background, the fluff, and some that are sort of from that time period that they might be able to, well, get away with. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. I don't expect the High Elves and the Dark Elves to make too quick an appearance. I also don't expect this to be a fully encompassing game system straight away. I think the first few factions is going to be exactly that, the first few factions. Bretonia and Khemri. 2 factions only on release, potentially with some sort of PDF books that allows you to play other factions within the system, but not fully fleshed out. And in fact, I expect it to go relatively quickly for the first couple of releases, and then to slow down dramatically, and then to begin the bloat. And I say that not to put a damper on things, but because we've seen that with literally every game system they've ever created. In fact, that's what's killing Warhammer 40,000 9th edition. They bloated it so badly, the only way to fix it is by bringing out an entirely new edition to sell you the solution to the problem they created. And it's the way every edition dies. I also foresee that the basic box set to this game probably will be in plastic. It will probably do pretty well in sales. It's going to have a massive level of hype around it. You're going to see these miniatures, box sets, being given out to every influencer under the sun, as well as a Warhammer World Open Day for Warhammer the Old World. And you're going to see all the same old faces trotted out, for better or worse, to come and do these community reveals. And that is fine. I want to really emphasize that. I'm not having a dig at the content creators who are going to come out. They're doing naturally where the wallet is going to lead them. I understand it. I don't necessarily respect it, but I definitely understand it. They'll all get trotted out in order to tell you about how much they've loved Warhammer Fantasy Battles, even though some of them weren't even in the hobby when Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition vanished around, what would it have been, about 2014, I think, Age of Sigmar released. So they're going to trot these people out, and they're going to all tell you about how much they loved it, and they're going to show you all the different ways they painted Bretonian heraldry, and how they painted Tomb Kings. You know, these ones have teal on their robes, these ones have blue on their robes, these ones are red on their robes, and they're all painted with bones. Oh, wow. That is what's going to happen. And then the stagnation will probably set in, where you'll get a few good releases pretty quickly for the system, and then it becomes the 3 to 6 months before you see your next update. Because again, that tends to be how it goes. And one of the other big concerns I have with the old world is you're going to see factions like Kislev playing a prominent role in it, I think. And with that, you're going to see a lot more of the more fantastical elements, maybe not to Age of Sigmar levels, but definitely to higher levels than old Warhammer Fantasy being brought in, with things like ice bows and ice weapons and more magical weapons in general. Now, I also don't expect the characters to be as crazy as the Age of Sigmar characters. Yes, there'll be characters on griffins and hippogriffs and wyverns and all that sort of thing, but they won't be to the same scale. They'll be much smaller. I don't imagine the price will be much smaller, but the units themselves will be much smaller. They will still be centerpiece units, but because they're designed for square bases and the way things will slot together, it'll be a lot more toned down in that regard. And in fact, I think you can already see that in here because of how subdued the weapon poses are. These arms are all relatively elbows tucked in, as it were, to the miniature because these cavalry have to rank up. You can't have Age of Sigmar posing with arms and shields and weapons pointing out in every direction because nothing would ever be able to stack. So that's a host of little minor predictions in this video for you of how everything is going to go. And if it sounds very cynical to you, I do apologize. It's not meant to be cynical, it's just meant to be realistic. Because that's how we have seen basically everything play out. And really, the release of Warhammer 10th Edition around the middle of the year, that's how that is going to play out, let's be honest. There's probably already sets going out to a lot of the key influencers within, I'm going to guess, this month. You know, it was this time a year ago that we got the Horus Heresy trailer, and it was shortly after that that we started seeing the Horus Heresy units popping up on Warhammer Community from the influencers. So Warhammer 10th starter set is most likely also out there right now doing the rounds. And that's going to be giving us the basically getting into our heads how this release is going to go. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see, won't it? Anyway, I'm sorry for the relatively cynical look at things. I really am. But if you're watching this video and you've watched it to this point, you probably agree with me because you probably can see a lot of these patterns for yourself. And if you couldn't before, now that I've said them, you probably will recognize them. So let's come back in a little while and see what predictions I got right and what I got wrong from this. Happy to eat my words if they prove me wrong. Of course, if they do something more despicable than my worst case scenarios, then I won't be eating my words. I'll be just disappointed. I'm well past the point of getting angry with the company. I'm not even angry about what they did with Dreadnoughts in 30k. Like, it's just a whatever at this point. Anyway, that's it from me. Back with the Outer Circle. Thank you all kindly for watching the video. Always appreciate it. Look after yourselves and thoughts and comments below, and I'll see you on the next one.